In a galaxy far from Earth, a new era of diplomacy was unfolding on one of the most advanced space stations ever built. This station, known as Luminara, was a beacon of progress, a meeting place for the most influential leaders and representatives of various alien species. It was a hub of power, knowledge, and conflict, where the most important decisions affecting the galaxy's future were made. The station floated quietly in the middle of a nebula, its sharp metallic edges contrasting against the glowing clouds of gas and dust surrounding it. Among the many ambassadors, diplomats, and warriors present, there was one individual who seemed utterly out of place. Her name was Ileana, and she was the first human to ever be invited to such an esteemed gathering. She was not an ambassador, not a soldier, and not even a scientist. In fact, Ileana had no specific role. She had no titles, no significant achievements to her name, and no special skills that set her apart. But her presence was undeniable. Ileana was quiet. In a universe where most beings communicated constantly, her silence was like an anchor in the middle of a storm. While the other species around her spoke loudly, gestured with grand expressions, and made their voices heard in every meeting, Ileana simply observed. It didn't find me out. At first, no one paid much attention to her. In a place like Luminara, full of highly intelligent and powerful creatures, a quiet human did not seem like a matter of concern. But things quickly began to change. Ileana's silence was unlike anything anyone had ever encountered. It was as if she had an aura about her that calmed the room. The loud debates, the heated exchanges, and the tense moments during council sessions always seemed to lose their sharp edge when she was near. Her silence, however, wasn't out of fear. It wasn't a result of insecurity or ignorance. No, Ileana's silence came from something far deeper, an unspoken strength that came from within. She had learned long ago that words could be both a gift and a curse. Words could betray you, mislead you, or start wars. But silence? Silence was powerful. It allowed her to observe, to understand, and to remain calm in a world filled with chaos. Most people who met Ileana found her presence to be strange. She never seemed to speak, never got involved in the loud conversations that swirled around her. But somehow, her quiet energy commanded respect. When someone else would get angry, Ileana's stillness made them stop and reconsider. When someone would boast or argue, Ileana's calm demeanor made them question whether they were truly in the right. One person in particular began to notice this. Prince Therox, the young heir to one of the galaxy's oldest and most respected empires, had never met anyone quite like Ileana. At first, he was just curious. He was the type of prince who was used to being surrounded by advisors, warriors, and politicians who all had something to say. The galaxy's politics were a game of words, and Therox was a skilled player. He knew how to speak with authority, how to persuade with passion, and how to make others bend to his will with the power of his voice. But Ileana, she never spoke. Not once had he heard her raise her voice. And yet there was something about her that made him feel uneasy, yet intrigued. It wasn't just her silence, it was the way she carried herself, how she seemed unaffected by the constant noise and chaos around her. One day, during a particularly heated meeting between two rival alien factions, the atmosphere grew thick with hostility. Words flew like daggers, accusations were hurled, and it seemed as though the entire council was about to explode into conflict. The two alien leaders, each representing powerful factions, were ready to draw their weapons. Tensions had been rising for weeks, and now it seemed like peace was no longer an option. And then, as if by instinct, Therox found himself moving towards Ileana. He didn't know why. The council chamber was filled with important beings, many of whom were far more qualified to deal with the situation. Yet Therox found himself gravitating towards the silent human. As the arguments continued, he stood behind her, his back to the chaos. Therox's actions didn't go unnoticed. The room fell silent as he stepped closer to Ileana, his posture stiff with uncertainty. No one had ever seen him act this way before. The prince, always so confident, always so composed, now appeared almost vulnerable. He stood there, not saying a word, hiding behind Eliana's silent strength. The atmosphere in the room shifted. The alien leaders paused in mid-argument, confused by the prince's behavior. Some of them exchanged nervous glances, while others seemed puzzled. Eliana didn't acknowledge him, nor did she react in any way. She remained calm, composed, as always. But something about her stillness had affected the prince. His heart beat faster in his chest, not from fear, but from something else. It was as if the quietness of the human was somehow able to steady his own racing thoughts. The longer he stood behind her, the more at peace he felt. It was as though her silence created a bubble of calm around him, a safe space where nothing else could reach him. The queen, Selvora, watched the scene unfold with a look of incredulity. As the supreme ruler of her people, she had seen many things in her life, but she had never seen anyone, even Therax, act so strangely. He had always been proud, always quick to show his strength, but now he was hiding behind a human, a quiet one, no less. The queen's mind raced. She had always known the prince to be strong-willed, always so eager to prove himself. Yet now, here he was, hiding behind someone so insignificant in the grand scheme of things. Eliana had no power, no position, no influence. She wasn't even an ambassador. She was just a human, yet her presence seemed to have a strange hold over the young prince. The tension in the room was thick, but it wasn't the shouting that made it unbearable. It was the silence. Everyone in the room fell into an awkward stillness, unsure of what to do or say next. No one had expected this. Even the queen, who had always prided herself on her ability to read any situation, could not fathom what was happening. Finally, the leader of the rival faction, a tall armored being from a distant star system, broke the silence. His voice was gruff and filled with suspicion.
"What is this? Is the prince so afraid of us that he hides behind a human?" Barox didn't respond.
Eliana didn't respond either. The silence between them stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Yet it was clear that it was the silence that had the power here, not the words. The queen's gaze lingered on Eliana. There was something about this human that unsettled her. She was not like the other delegates. The other species, proud, strong, and loud, had always been so easy to predict. But Eliana was an enigma. The queen could not understand her, and that, in itself, made her dangerous. In the end, it wasn't words that resolved the tension. It was the silent understanding that passed between the prince and the quiet human. Slowly, one by one, the alien leaders stepped back from the brink of conflict. The prince, still standing behind Eliana, nodded to his fellow delegates, signaling that peace would be possible. As the meeting finally came to a close, Therax lingered for a moment, casting a final glance at Eliana. She stood there, still as ever, her calm presence like a shield against the storm of emotions that had just passed. The prince walked away, but his mind was heavy with thoughts of the human who had somehow managed to remain untouched by the chaos around her. He was no longer sure who she was. But one thing was clear: Eliana was far more than she appeared, and the galaxy would soon realize that the power of silence could change everything.
The days following the tense council meeting were filled with whispers and curious glances.
Eliana's silence, once an unnoticed trait, had become the subject of discussions across the galaxy's most influential space station. The quiet human, whose very presence seemed to affect the flow of events, had become the center of attention. Some viewed her with admiration, others with suspicion. But no one could deny that there was something undeniably powerful about her. Therax, the young prince, found himself increasingly drawn to Eliana. He had never known someone like her, so still, so unbothered by the usual chaos that filled the halls of Luminara. He couldn't stop thinking about how she had stood there, unaffected by the storm of emotions and words swirling around her, While the others shouted, argued, and threatened, Eliana had simply watched in silence, her presence alone managing to calm the room. It was as if her silence spoke louder than any words could. The prince's curiosity grew with each passing day. He had always been taught that power came from strength, from action, from words. Yet Eliana had shown him that power could also come from stillness, from the quiet confidence that came with knowing when not to speak. He began to seek her out, finding excuses to be near her, to observe her from a distance. He found that, in her presence, his own mind seemed to quiet, as though the very act of being near her allowed him to think more clearly. Eliana, for her part, remained as silent as ever. She never spoke, never reached out to others. She simply existed in the background, her calm presence a stark contrast to the frenzy of the political games around her. Yet she was not unaware of the attention she was receiving. She could feel the eyes upon her, the curiosity, the wonder, and sometimes the fear. But none of it seemed to bother her. She had learned long ago that silence could protect her in ways words could not. One afternoon, as the sun outside Luminara's observation windows bathed the station in a warm golden light, Eliana sat in a quiet corner, looking out at the stars. Her eyes traced the patterns of distant constellations, her mind drifting from one thought to the next. She often found peace in moments like this, when the station's usual hum of activity faded into the background. Here she could think without the distractions of words or voices. Terex approached her quietly, almost hesitantly. He had become accustomed to Eliana's stillness, but he still wasn't sure how to approach her. He had tried to speak to her several times, but she had always remained silent, her gaze unwavering. "Eliana," he said softly, unsure if she would respond. He had called her name before, but it had always been in passing, never in a way that invited conversation. This time, something in his voice seemed to catch her attention. She turned her head slowly, her gaze meeting his. For a moment, there was nothing but the quiet between them. Orcs waited, as if unsure of what to say next. Eliana's eyes were calm, but there was something in them that made him feel both seen and unseen at the same time. It was as if she could look right through him, understanding him without him needing to say a word. He hesitated again. "I don't understand," he admitted.
"You never speak, and yet—"
It's like you understand everything. You see things that others miss.
"How do you do that?" Eliana did not speak. She simply watched him, her gaze steady and unblinking. Thorax waited for an answer, but he knew deep down that she wouldn't give him one. Her silence was not something to be explained, not something that could be put into words. It was simply a part of who she was, and perhaps that was all he needed to understand. After a long moment, Thorax took a step back, feeling a strange mix of admiration and frustration. He had always been one to seek answers, to push until he got them, but with Eliana, there was no pushing. She gave nothing away, and yet, in some strange way, that made him feel as though he had learned something. The next day, Eliana was once again the subject of quiet conversations among the leaders and delegates. Word had spread about the incident during the council meeting, and many began to wonder about the human who had somehow made the prince, one of the most powerful beings in the galaxy, seek refuge behind her. Some saw it as a sign of weakness in Thorax, but others recognized that it was something far more profound. Eliana's silence had a power of its own, one that could influence even the most powerful of leaders. Queen Selvora, ever the calculating ruler, had taken note of this. She was not one to be easily impressed, but Eliana's quiet influence was something she could not ignore. The queen, always in control of her emotions and actions, found herself unsettled by Eliana's unspoken strength. It was as if the human could see through the facade of diplomacy and politics, cutting to the heart of every issue without saying a single word. Selvora had long been wary of the rising tensions between the factions she ruled over. Her empire was vast, and her influence stretched across the galaxy, but she knew that the current peace was fragile. Her enemies were waiting for a moment of weakness, and she was determined not to show any. But in Eliana's presence, she felt something shift within her, a quiet fear that she couldn't explain. The queen called for a private meeting with her most trusted advisors. They spoke of the human, of her growing influence, and the way she had affected the prince.
We must not underestimate her, Queen Silvora warned. Her silence is not an accident.
It is a weapon in its own right. One of the advisors, a seasoned diplomat named Harvok, spoke up.
Your Majesty, we cannot allow one human to disrupt the balance of power here.
If we don't control her, she could become a threat.
Silvora's eyes narrowed. Control her?
How? We cannot force her to speak. We cannot force her to reveal her secrets. The more we try to understand her, the more we will lose control. Harvok hesitated before responding. Perhaps we should make her speak. If we can break her silence, we can break her power. The queen considered this idea for a moment.
Yes, she said slowly. If we can get her to speak, we can learn the true extent of her influence.
But we must be careful. If she speaks, and if her words carry the same weight as her silence, we could find ourselves in a situation we cannot control. Meanwhile, Eliana remained unaware of the growing interest in her. She continued to keep to herself, her silence her only shield. She spent her days observing, listening to the conversations around her, but never participating. There was no need to speak. She understood everything she needed to know simply by listening to the unspoken emotions in the room, the subtle shifts in posture, the faintest changes in tone. One evening, as Eliana sat alone in a quiet observation deck, she heard footsteps approaching. This time, she didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Barracks stood behind her, his presence a mixture of curiosity and uncertainty. He had grown used to being in control, to having the answers to every question. But with Eliana, he felt like he was standing in the dark, unsure of what to do next. "I don't know why I keep coming to you," Therox said, his voice soft. "I don't know what you're doing to me, but I can't stop thinking about it. I've spent my entire life learning to control everything around me, to bend the galaxy to my will. But with you, I feel like I'm losing control." Eliana remained silent, but she could feel the weight of his words. There was a vulnerability in his voice that she hadn't expected. It was the first time she had ever heard him speak so openly, without the usual confidence and authority that he carried. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence between them was not uncomfortable, but it was thick with the unspoken understanding that neither of them could truly explain. Eliana turned her head slightly, catching his gaze for the briefest of moments. Therox, sensing something in her look, took a step back, unsure of what he had just experienced. "I don't know why you don't speak," Therox said quietly, "but whatever it is, it's something powerful. I think I need to learn to understand it."
And with that, he turned and walked away, leaving Eliana in the silence once more.
But this time, the silence felt different. It was no longer just a shield. It was something that could change the course of history. And Eliana, ever the observer, knew that the galaxy was on the brink of something extraordinary, something that she could not yet fully understand, but something that she would play a pivotal role in. The days passed slowly, each one seeming to stretch longer than the last. The atmosphere aboard Luminara had shifted. Where once it had been a buzzing hive of activity and chatter, it now seemed quieter, as if the entire station was holding its breath. Eliana's presence had become a topic of fascination for everyone. Her silence, her stillness, her ability to change the course of events without ever saying a word. Prince Therox couldn't stop thinking about her. His thoughts had been clouded with confusion and curiosity since that day he had hidden behind her during the council meeting. He couldn't explain why her silence had such an effect on him. No one else had ever made him feel this way, not even the most powerful of his allies or the fiercest of his enemies. With Eliana, there was a calmness that he had never experienced before. It was as if everything he thought he knew about power and control had been turned upside down. Tharax had grown up in a world of words, powerful speeches, commanding voices, and high-stakes negotiations. But with Eliana, none of that mattered. She didn't speak, yet it felt as if she understood everything. There was a depth to her quietness that he couldn't fully grasp, but he couldn't help but be drawn to it. Over the next few weeks, the prince found more reasons to seek her out. He would find himself walking through the corridors of Luminara, his feet leading him to places where he knew she would be. Sometimes she would be sitting by a window, staring out into the vast emptiness of space, her face calm and unreadable. Other times she would be alone in a quiet corner, her body still, her eyes focused on some distant thought. One afternoon, as the station's lights flickered from the orange of sunset to the cold blue of night, Tharax stood in the doorway of a small room where Eliana sat. She didn't look up when he entered, her attention still fixed on the stars beyond the glass. For a moment, Tharax hesitated. He had grown accustomed to his own voice, to the power of words, but now, standing in front of Eliana, he found himself unsure of what to say. "Why don't you speak?" he asked quietly, his voice betraying a hint of frustration. Eliana didn't respond. She didn't even look at him. Her gaze remained steady, her eyes fixed on the vastness outside the window. Tharax stood there for a moment, waiting for an answer that never came. He wasn't sure why he had asked the question. Perhaps it was because he wanted to understand, or maybe because he needed to hear something from her, anything that would make sense of the confusion in his mind. But Eliana's silence was not something that could be explained with words. It was simply who she was. Tharax could sense that now. Her silence wasn't something she chose. It was something that defined her. He had been searching for a reason, a justification for her quietness, but perhaps there wasn't one. It was just a part of her, like the stars outside the window, vast, unexplainable, and constant. "I wish I could understand you," Tharax muttered under his breath. For the first time, Eliana turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge him. Her gaze met his, calm and steady, but there was something in her eyes, a depth, a knowing, that made him feel as though she understood him better than anyone ever had. "You don't need to understand," she said, her voice soft and steady. It was the first time she had spoken since their brief exchange during the council meeting, and her words were more powerful than anything Tharax had ever heard.
Not everyone needs to be understood. Sometimes silence is the answer.
Tharax stood frozen for a moment, taking in her words. He had expected to hear an explanation, a reason for her silence. But instead, she had given him something deeper. A truth. Something that made him feel as though the very foundation of his beliefs had been shaken. "I don't understand," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how you do it. You change everything around you without speaking a single word. How is that possible?" Eliana's gaze softened, and she gave a small, almost imperceptible shrug. "This is Davy, It's about being. Sometimes, the most powerful things are those that don't need to be said." Tharax wanted to say something, but the words didn't come. He had always believed that action was the key to everything, that power lay in what you could do, what you could command. But Eliana had shown him a different kind of power. The power of stillness, of quietness, of being present without the need to force things into motion. For the first time in his life, Tharax found himself questioning everything he had been taught. In his world, it had always been about control, about making others bend to your will. But Eliana's world was different. She didn't try to control anything. She simply existed, and in doing so, she created a sense of calm that spread to everyone around her. The more Tharax thought about it, the more he realized how little he truly understood about the universe. He had always been taught that strength came from the ability to control others, to dominate and conquer. But Eliana had shown him that true strength didn't come from control. It came from understanding, from being at peace with yourself and allowing that peace to spread to others. The following days brought new challenges. Tensions between the various factions aboard Luminara had reached a boiling point, and the council sessions were becoming more and more heated. Queen Selvora, growing increasingly wary of Eliana's influence, had begun to take more aggressive actions. She had ordered that Eliana be kept under close observation, hoping to find some weakness or flaw in her silence. If she could uncover the secret to Eliana's power, perhaps she could use it to her advantage. But Eliana remained unchanged. She continued to move through the station with the same quiet grace, her presence a calming influence on everyone she encountered. Even the most hot-headed leaders, those who had once been eager to fight and argue, found themselves pausing in her presence. The peace she brought wasn't something that could be forced or manipulated. It simply existed. One evening, as Eliana sat in the council hall, her attention focused on the ongoing debate, she noticed Therox standing near the door. His eyes were fixed on her, a mixture of curiosity and admiration in his gaze. She felt a shift in the air as he approached, the usual tension that accompanied his presence now replaced by a sense of calm. It was as if her silence had an effect on him, just as it had on everyone else around her. Therox walked up to her slowly, his steps hesitant. He didn't know what he wanted to say, but there was something about Eliana's calm presence that made him feel as though he could let go of the weight of the world for just a moment. "You've changed everything," Therox said softly, his voice filled with awe. "I don't know how, but you have." Eliana didn't reply immediately. She simply looked at him, her gaze steady and understanding. She could see the struggle in his eyes, the conflict between the person he had been and the person he was becoming.
"You don't have to change the world," she said quietly. "Just be yourself."
That's all anyone can do. Therox nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling over him.
For the first time in a long while, he felt as though he had found something real, something true. As the council session continued, the debates raged on around them. But for Therox, the world seemed quieter now. The noise, the arguments, the power struggles, they all felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. All that mattered was the stillness that Eliana had brought into his life, a stillness that allowed him to see things more clearly than he ever had before. And in that moment, Therox realized that it wasn't about winning or losing. It wasn't about dominating or controlling. It was about understanding, about finding peace in a world that was constantly in turmoil. Eliana had shown him that, and for the first time, he felt like he was beginning to understand her. But the journey was far from over. Queen Selvora, still watching from the shadows, had yet to reveal her next move. She was not one to be easily outmaneuvered, and she had already begun to lay her plans for how to deal with Eliana's growing influence. The quiet human was a threat to everything she had worked for, and the queen would stop at nothing to regain control. But for now, Eliana remained calm, her presence unshaken. The galaxy around her was in chaos, but she knew something that the others didn't. True power wasn't in the ability to control the world. It was in the ability to remain unshaken, to find peace in the midst of it all. And as long as she remained silent, the universe would continue to be hers to shape. The tension that had settled over Luminara was now palpable. The space station, once a bustling center of diplomatic activity and political negotiations, had become a quiet battlefield. Behind the scenes, Queen Selvora watched Eliana closely, studying her every move with suspicion. The queen had long ruled with an iron fist, her empire a well-oiled machine driven by fear and control. But Eliana's presence had thrown everything into disarray. The human silence, her calmness, and the power she wielded without uttering a single word had become an unexpected challenge to the queen's authority. Despite the mounting pressure from the other factions, Queen Selvora remained determined not to let anyone, especially Eliana, undermine her reign. She had seen many challenges to her power over the years, but none like this. This wasn't about strength in numbers or the might of armies. No, this was something far more dangerous, a force that was not seen, but felt, and that was what made it so difficult to control. Eliana, for her part, remained as she always had, silent, observant, and calm. She continued to walk the halls of Luminara with the same quiet grace, unaffected by the growing whispers and curious stares that followed her. The political games and power struggles raged around her, but she had learned long ago that nothing could be solved through conflict. She understood people not through words, but through silence. In silence, there were no distractions. In silence, the truth could be heard. The prince, Therox, had become more and more drawn to Eliana, not just because of her silence, but because of the sense of peace she brought with her. He had spent so much of his life fighting for control, striving to be the ruler his people expected him to be. Yet, in Eliana's presence, he felt a strange sense of release, a quiet surrender to something bigger than himself. It wasn't that he wanted to follow her, but rather that he had come to realize that true leadership didn't come from domination. It came from understanding and listening, and that was something Eliana had shown him, without saying a word. One evening, as the stars outside Luminara's observation windows shimmered like distant jewels, Therox sought out Eliana once more. He had been thinking about her constantly, about her ability to remain unaffected by the chaos around her. He had tried to talk to her before, but she always remained silent, as though her words were unnecessary. He had learned to respect that, but part of him still wanted to understand her, to find out what lay beneath the calm exterior. As he entered the observation deck, he saw her standing by the large window, gazing out into the endless void of space. Her posture was relaxed, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Therox simply watched her, unsure of what to say. There was something about her that made him feel small, not in a way that was degrading, but in a way that reminded him of how little he truly knew about the universe. "Eliana," he said softly, his voice carrying in the quiet room, "I've been thinking about what you said. About silence being the answer." She didn't look at him, but he could feel her attention shift slightly, as though she had acknowledged him without speaking.
I've spent so much of my life trying to control everything, Therox continued. But with you, I don't feel the need to control anything.
I don't even know what I'm supposed to be doing anymore. Still, Eliana didn't speak.
She stood there, as still and calm as ever, her presence like an anchor in the storm of his thoughts. Therox had always been the center of attention, always the one in control, but now, for the first time, he felt like he was standing in the shadows, trying to understand the world around him. He took a step closer to her, his eyes fixed on her profile. "How do you do it?" he asked. "How do you stay so calm, so untouchable? Don't you ever want to say something?"
Don't you ever feel the need to speak your mind?
Eliana's gaze shifted slightly, but she still didn't answer. Instead, she turned her attention back to the stars, her silence speaking volumes. Therox stood there, feeling the weight of her stillness pressing down on him. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it was disorienting. He had always been the one who spoke, the one who acted, but Eliana's silence had a power of its own, one that he could no longer ignore.
I think I've been looking for answers in all the wrong places, Therox said, more to himself than to her. I've been searching for strength in words, in power, in domination.
But maybe the true strength lies in something else.
Eliana finally turned to face him, her eyes meeting his with a calmness that sent a chill down his spine.
It wasn't a look of judgment or disdain, but one of understanding, and in that moment, Therox realized that he had been searching for validation his entire life, seeking approval from others, trying to prove himself worthy of his position. But Eliana, with her silence and her stillness, had shown him that he didn't need to prove anything. The power wasn't in the approval of others. It was in knowing who you were without needing anyone else to tell you. The realization hit him like a wave, and for the first time, he felt a sense of clarity that he had never experienced before. Eliana had not given him the answers, but she had helped him find them within himself. She had not taught him with words, but with her presence. And that, Therex understood now, was a kind of power that words could never match. As the quiet stretched between them, the rocks realized that he had been wrong all along. It wasn't about control, or power, or domination. It was about understanding, about peace, and about finding strength in stillness. And it was Eliana's silence that had taught him that lesson. But even as Tharox felt this newfound understanding, the shadow of Queen Selvora loomed over the station. The queen had watched the growing influence Eliana had over the prince with increasing unease. She could feel her grip on power slipping, and she wasn't willing to let it go so easily. The queen had seen threats come and go, but Eliana was different. The human was a wild card, unpredictable and untouchable, and that made her dangerous. Selvora had always been a master of manipulation, but with Eliana, there was no way to manipulate her. The queen could not force the human to speak, nor could she intimidate her into submission. Instead, Selvora began to hatch a plan that would force Eliana to reveal her power, to expose her vulnerability. If Eliana could be made to speak, to act, then she could be controlled. And once she was under control, the queen would no longer have to worry about her influence over the prince. But Eliana, as always, remained unaffected by the queen's schemes. She continued to move through Luminara with the same calm presence, untouched by the politics that raged around her. She did not seek to control anyone, but neither did she allow anyone to control her. Her silence, her stillness, had become her greatest weapon, and the queen, despite all her power, couldn't break it. As the days passed, the situation on Luminara grew more tense. The factions continued to argue, the queen continued to plot, and Therox continued to wrestle with his newfound understanding of what true strength really meant. But through it all, Eliana remained the same, silent, calm, and unwavering. And in that silence, she held the power to change the galaxy.